Good evening. Welcome to Q&A live from the beautiful Great Hall of Australia's Parliament House. I'm Tony Jones. We're here tonight at the invitation of the presiding officers, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, to join the parliamentary celebrations for the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. That was a copy of it. The camera just flew over. Well, it's regarded as the founding document of our democracy, but in a world of terror, globalisation and surveillance, is democracy thriving or is it under threat? Here to answer your questions tonight, Senior Counsel Bret Walker, a member of the Rule of Law Institute's Magna Carta Committee. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Bronwyn Bishop. Founder of New Democracy, Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, who believes our political system is broken. The President of the Human Rights Commission, Gillian Triggs. And Cape York Indigenous leader and advocate for a rightful place, Noel Pearson. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, 800 years after it was sealed, Magna Carta is still relevant and still in dispute. Let's go to our first question, which is from Shane Drumgold.
Medieval historians say that Magna Carta was just an agreement giving wealthy barons even more wealth in exchange for not overthrowing a grossly incompetent king, and actually did nothing for the common man. If we need such a symbol for justice, is Magna Carta really the best one that we can find?
Bret Walker.
It's absolutely not. It's a primitive beginning of a process. It had things before it, it had things after it, many hundreds of years after it. What we have, if you'll forgive me being a constitutional lawyer for a moment, is Chapter 3 of our Constitution. That's a much better, solid guarantee of justice exercised by the judicial power.
Now, originally the Magna Carta was just for these rich barons, as the question implies. How did it come to be applied more generally, Bret?
Largely, it seems to me, by myth, a very beneficial myth, not so much a lie as a transformation. The expression free man is the one I like best in the document. Free men were not a majority of people. We all regard ourselves as free men and women, and I have to keep adding that when one reads the word man, it probably included women. So free man in Magna Carta is a magic phrase. It didn't mean what we mean by it, but it's come to mean that, not as Magna Carta, but by the constant use, reuse. Think of it as a rough pebble that's become worn smooth, and now the notion of individuals being free under law is something that we can sensibly trace to Magna Carta, just not literally so.
Bronwyn Bishop, it's said that the members of the founders of the United States, those people who wrote the Constitution, carried in their pockets, many of them, the Magna Carta. Why did they do that, do you suppose?
Well, the Magna Carta, as Bret has just said, encompassed more than just the barons. It was meant to be a peace agreement, actually, between the barons and the king. The rebels had already taken over the city of London. It was probably written by Archbishop Langton. But it also said something very important, and that is that all should be subject to the law. And there was this concept of the golden English law, probably going back to Edward the Confessor. What happened to take it to the United States, which was so special, was that King George actually issued a charter similar to the Magna Carta to Virginia, and then went on and did it to state after state. So the message actually was there in a written charter form. And because of the time when of the ferment and the concept of no taxation without representation and individual rights, it seemed to really strike a chord. And so the Americans have really taken it to heart, and it is still quoted today. People will put up a proposition and quote the Magna Carta. In fact, it's been through many a manifestation. But it does have a sort of mystique. It's almost like the Holy Grail, if you like, of the beginning of when we say the rule of law may have started.
Gillian Triggs, what do you think?
Well, I think that if we concentrate too much on particular details of the Magna Carta, we miss what it actually has become, because it's symbolic of the first written occasion in which it was clear that the king and the sovereign is subject to the rule of law. Now, there are provisions of Magna Carta that are important. No detention without trial by our equals or according to the rule of law. These grand statements were there, and they live with us today.
Corpus.
Well, what ultimately became habeas corpus had its origins. So I think if we put this in Australian parlance and remember the castle, it's the vibes. It's what it really means to us. And in a way, it's that cultural acceptance of what was so important that is vital today, that nobody is above the law, not even, in those days, the sovereign, but of course today, executive government.
Noel Pearson, what does it mean to you?
As a student of the law at Sydney, I became very entranced with the common law, and I always said that of all of the miserable cargo that came out of the British Isles, there were three very beautiful things: Earl Grey's tea, that sublime game cricket, and the common law of England. This British heritage is now part of my own heritage. It is the heritage of all Australians, whether they come from the British Isles or who are indigenous to this country. I think the beneficial myth that Bret alludes to is a myth that inures for the benefit of all Australians today.
What do you value most from it? Because you might say that when common law began to apply in Australia, in the very first days of the colony, it didn't apply to the original inhabitants.
Yeah, and it took 204 years before its benefits were made manifest for the original peoples of this country. The law had actually, according to the theory, fallen onto the soil of the country back in 1788, but its benefit didn't come until the Mabo decision of the High Court on 3 June 1992. That's why I honour the common law. I've been around Parliament House today trawling, and I see a lot of images of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and a whole lot of other heroes. I would put, if I were in this house, Lord Denning, Master of the Rolls, on my front door.
Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, what does the Magna Carta mean to you?
Well, I think at its heart, it refers to judgments by one's peers, the question of habeas corpus, and I'm intrigued as the only non-lawyer here, if you like, the amateur, the bush lawyer. I've always been intrigued by how, even in this place, which is our legislature, so the legislature really is made by the people, by one's peers. I'm interested in seeing how, I see this as a catalyst, as an opportune catalyst to see how we can innovate our democracy, how we can look to improve our government. And I think here we have Magna Carta that suggests there are our peers, everyday people who are the reasonable people, the reasonable person that should be looked to guide us in respect of how we do our democracy in the future. So I see an inclusive conversation, a national dialogue, this opportune catalyst now with Magna Carta to have a national dialogue as to how we can improve our government so that it can be more collaborative, more inclusive, and have better representation.
Well, more on that later. Next question comes from Philip Bailey.
My question's for Bret Walker. Since September 11, governments around the world have told us that we need a new type of criminal law. And many forms of this criminal law infringe on existing legal principles such as habeas corpus and freedom of association. And I was wondering if you think that the current state of global terrorism, or its threat, if you like, warrants these new types of laws.
No, not at all. It seems to me there's much more evidence of a consensus that terrorism is criminal, it's not war, and it's best dealt with as a crime. And all crimes, including the most horrific, are best dealt with by fair and decent traditional means. Each country will have its own, and the traditions will evolve. In this country, for serious offences under Commonwealth law, which is terrorism, that means trial by jury. That means evidence that is tested, and that means fair and proper investigation. All of that, it seems to me, is a very important blow against the evils that terrorism has this pretentious ambition to visit upon all of us. Pretentious because there is no possibility of success in world domination by terrorists, but it is an ambition that leads to horrific acts, and it's best dealt with as crime by ordinary process.
I'm going to go back to our questioner. I know from reading your question that you're actually a lawyer. Are you concerned by what you've seen? Is that the heart of your question?
I am, and I'm experienced in constitutional law, and it seems to me, I mean, without giving a comment, Tony, because I know you enjoy the comments, but I guess it's more a question which is, I've always wanted to have an example explained to me with Parliament. They often tell us that we need these new types of laws. And I'd like it explained to me what kind of crime could have been committed post-911 that we can't deal with the existing laws that we had pre-911?
I think the short answer is the conspiracy offences would capture many, maybe nearly all, of those that are now on the books. There is a sliver, maybe bigger than a sliver, of very preliminary conduct which in this country now represent very serious offences for which you can be sent to jail for a very long time, as some people have been. That's my answer. Those have been added, but I have to say I'm not quite sure whether they needed to be. Our pre-existing laws addressed most of the evils.
Bronwyn Bishop, you look like you're about to leap in there, but one is never too sure.
Well, there are a couple of things to say, aren't there? That first of all, the first job of a government is to look after the safety of its people. That's its first task. And if you can't do that, then you've not much hope of giving good government after that. The second thing is, when you're talking about laws being in place to deal with acts that may have occurred, you're talking about things that are post facto. We as a government have a responsibility, or the government has a responsibility, to ensure that things don't happen. And with the new laws that have been put in place, our security people and our security forces, if you like that term, have been very successful in preventing really bad attacks occurring. Now, we don't want to see the equivalent of a 9/11 or anything else. We want to prevent it happening, and therefore you've got to have good intelligence, and you do need additional legislation.
Gillian Triggs, what do you say to this?
Well, we are very concerned at the Human Rights Commission at the very significant increase in legislation, some of it introduced in great haste just before Christmas. We would argue that in times of concern and stress about terrorism, these are the moments when we really have to defend our key liberties and freedoms even more strongly. We cannot allow terrorism to have the effect that 23 million Australians are being subject to surveillance to unprecedented degrees. The test as a matter of law is, are these new laws necessary and proportionate to achieve the outcome? And I think there's at least a very strong argument that many of these laws are unnecessary and disproportionate to the aim. I think we've got new laws coming in on social media monitoring to come in. We've seen metadata laws coming in that will affect the entire or a large part of the Australian community at the very time when, of course, the Americans are replacing their Patriot Act with a Freedom Act and reducing the access to metadata. We have new crimes that prohibit advocating terrorism, and we have very serious 5- and 10-year mandatory sentences for those who might give information about those special intelligence operations. And what I'd suggest is that, one, we already have some fairly comprehensive laws, but secondly, we now have very wide-ranging laws that prohibit whether we can go to a foreign country to declared areas, and whether we can speak freely about matters that concern us.
Very briefly, in a recent speech, you asked the following question: what are the options for democracy when both major parties, in government and opposition, agree upon laws which violate fundamental freedoms? Which fundamental freedoms do you mean exactly?
Well, I am very concerned, for example, that parliaments are willing to pass laws that, for example, explicitly state that the acts of ASIO officers would not be subject to civil and criminal prosecution if they overstep the mark. Legislation is now being introduced to allow guards of detention centres to use levels of force that the Australian Federal Police do not have. We have a piece of legislation in an amendment to the Migration Act which specifically excludes the Refugees Convention and allows the minister to make a determination as to whether or not the person becomes a refugee within his or her determination. But what I'm suggesting is that we have a curious position in that Parliament has always been the body designed to protect our freedoms. It's always exercised restraint against an executive or government that wants more power. And what we're seeing in recent years across both governments, or the former government and the present government, is a willingness to pass laws that really are much more extreme than we need, and where you've got a collusion, really, of both major parties to allow the executive these increased powers, so that the role of Parliament in protecting freedoms is being diminished. And indeed also so too are the powers of the judiciary to review the decisions of ministers.
Noel Pearson, listening to this, do you have similar concerns?
Tony, all I can say is that what a glorious thing it is to have a Human Rights Commission supervising and calling to account a strong Parliament and government. What a good system. And I think that the dialogue should be robust both ways. But essentially, I think we are blessed to have a democracy that allows a very robust relationship to exist on the part of an independent commission, and a government that at the end of the day, as Bronwyn said, has a duty to its citizens. And the people
That's
who
the
elect
first
it.
duty, and I have to say that I disagree with a lot of what Gillian had to say. Because the first duty is to look after the people. We are answerable to the people at the ballot box, and it is a working and free democracy, the best in the world, in my view. And the fact that we have criticisms about the precautions that are being taken to ensure the safety of our people can be fair commentary, but sometimes it can overstep the mark too. And there is a time, and I think Gillian recognises it, when you're a statutory officer, you have to decide whether you are a statutory officer fulfilling that role with security of tenure, or whether you wish to say, I want to be part of the political debate and stand for office and run and become part of that political process.
Okay, we're going to move... well, actually, that question has his hand up. I'll quickly go to our original questioner. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I loved what you had to say, Gillian, and I just want to turn the question to Bret. And this isn't about any particular government, but I just want to ask you,
It has to be
Bret,
brief because we've got another question to get.
Do you think that governments in general in Australia have engaged in overreach in relation to anti-terrorism? Not this government, just Australian governments.
Not overreach in terms of the broad scope of powers. I believe you have to have surveillance, and I want surveillance to be lawful. In many other places, in many other times, it's been unlawful. So laws authorising surveillance and monitoring it and requiring checks, I'm all in favour of that. However, I must say we have a national predilection to legislating at extraordinary length and with great frequency, and there has been overreach in terms of the sheer multiplicity of law. It is more complex, it's very sophisticated, it's very fine intellectual work, but I suspect, well, I'm sure, that we've got far too much of it.
We'll go to a question on a very specific piece of legislation. It's from Daniel McNamara.
My question's for Bret Walker. As law students of the 21st century, we're always taught of the sanctity of the separation of powers. Although issues with ministerial discretion will always inevitably exist, there are multiple courts in Australia that can override or nullify unlawful ministerial discretionary choices. Therefore, why do you believe that the proposed citizenship laws by the federal government give too much discretion to the executive if this discretion can be lawfully appealed to the judiciary?
It's very simple. I'm a very strong proponent of ministerial discretion in relation to revocation of citizenship. but I don't believe that it's possible for that discretion to be exercised in relation to the simple fact of whether an offence has been committed. The laws we already have in this country provide ministerial discretion after an offence has been committed and a conviction recorded or the offence proved. And that's a very good thing. If somebody has been convicted of one of these offences in a process where they have been contrite, have offered cooperation and have probably offered admissible evidence against other people who have not pleaded guilty, then I, for one, would like to think that there is a prospect that a minister will not recommend revocation of citizenship for that person when he or she comes out of prison. That's the kind of discretion I want. I don't want mandatory sentencing in relation to revocation of citizenship. What I don't want, however, is ministers acting in place of a criminal court.
But Bret, I listened to an interview with you this morning, and you said that in the report that you gave, you did not expressly say that there needed to be a conviction before the discretionary power to the minister, which you recommended, be considered. You went on to say that perhaps in context, or if you'd read a bit other of it, you may have come to the implication that you may have meant that. But I know you to be the sound, disciplined lawyer that you are, and I've never seen you equivocate like that before.
I don't think I did equivocate. It never occurred to me in relation to this question that anybody would regard a conviction as unnecessary. The very previous recommendation in my report included recommendations to include terrorism offences in the existing revocation power. The existing revocation power requires a conviction or offence proved, that is, in a court. It never occurred to me, and for this I apologise, that anybody would ever think that a minister's discretion could extend to the fact of an offence. And
are you suggesting that your advice was misinterpreted or just ignored?
Well, I think it's fair if I say...
That question was to Bret, if you don't mind.
Sorry.
Speaker.
I was about to say, and it may be that I'm about to say something that the Speaker will appreciate. I think, read on its own, the recommendation in question leaves all mention of conviction out. There's no mention of it at all, nor is there in the discussion precedes it. That is because I was talking about adding a power to powers that already existed, all of which have at their heart a conviction. Didn't have to discuss it because, and I confess this is an error of mine, it never occurred to me that in this country, with our separation of powers which is mandatory, that anyone would think that the commission of an offence could be committed to the opinion of one minister, a committee of ministers or cabinet. That's all.
But Bret, I think to listen to the words is important. What you did say is consideration should be given to the introduction of a power for the Minister for Immigration to revoke the citizenship of Australians, where to do so would not render them stateless, where the Minister is satisfied that the person has engaged in acts prejudicial to the Australian security and it is not in Australia's interest for the person to remain in Australia.
And that's modelled on section 34, where you'll find the satisfaction is posited upon there having been an offence committed, the commission of which produces in the minister's mind a satisfaction that this person should no longer be a citizen in the interests of security. Yep. It models what we already have when somebody applies to be a citizen of this country. They will have a security check, and if ASIO doesn't give them a clearance, they won't become a citizen.
Can I just a quick follow-up here and a quick answer if you can, because it appears that what's being proposed here is that people can have their citizenship stripped away on the basis of intelligence. And as Philip Ruddock suggested to us on this program last week, possibly the intelligence from informants who cannot be named. Does that fall in any way into the separation of powers?
Well, of course it does. It demonstrates how very different a ministerial opinion is from a verdict of a jury. Untested intelligence is the kind of material, for example, on the basis of which some people are saying Australian officers bribed people smugglers. And because it's untested intelligence or hearsay from another country, we are told that we should not leap to a conclusion that it is correct. If it's fair for that kind of controversy, I would have thought it's very obvious it's fair for somebody who is accused of being a foreign fighter or a terrorist that the evidence be assembled and be tested. And that's what we call a criminal trial.
Okay. Let's quickly hear from our other panellists. Luca, you wanted to get involved in this discussion, I could see.
Not really. I think all's been said. I mean, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gillian Triggs, just finally from you.
Well, going back to the Magna Carta, there's a very clear provision in the Magna Carta that no man may be made an outlaw or an alien except under the law of the land. And that would include, I would imagine, and think fair, that there would be a proper judgment by a court based on the evidence as Bret has laid out. So I think it's a crucial part of the English common law system that's developed from the Magna Carta.
So are you in breach of practice in law, of the basis of law, if you do it differently?
Well, the difficulty is this concept of separation of powers. It's been fundamental that we have an executive government, a parliament, and the judiciary. And when you allow executive government through parliament to pass laws, which then exclude the role of the judiciary, so that the executive government is making both the law and determining whether somebody has breached it, that is when you've violated the principle of the separation of powers. And that's a fundamentally dangerous thing to do in a democratic society.
There are two things to say about that. Firstly, the Magna Carta, Article 51, also says, "And immediately after restoring peace, we shall remove from the realm all alien knights, crossbowmen, sergeants and mercenaries who have come with horses and arms to the injury of the realm." You can quote the Magna Carta to go each way on it. The fact of the matter is that the duty of the government is to protect the Australian people. And the Australian people's interest is served if people who are fought against us in another land
I don't think
ought not to come back to Australia.
I don't think we're talking about that, Bronwyn. We're talking about determination of those people who have fought against other people in another land, their conviction be determined by a court, not by the minister. That's what we're saying.
Okay, it's time to move on to other subjects. We've got a question from Matt Ryan.
Noel Pearson has recently broken with consensus on the campaign to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution by rejecting the symbolic language of the expert panel in favour of a declaration of recognition outside the Constitution, among other changes. Will his proposal satisfy the constitutional conservatives or merely further fracture a campaign that has already stalled?
Noel Pearson.
I think the question of poetic acknowledgement is one where you could do it in a measly preamble to the Constitution, where you'd be arguing over, was this country owned by the Aboriginal people? Nah, people won't agree with that. Was it occupied? People don't agree with that. Do Indigenous people have some kind of relationship with the land, and so on? We'd get into a kind of really miserable set of words around recognition. Whereas in a declaration, we could be as generous as possible and tell the true story that this continent was owned by its traditional owners before the coming of Europeans. It would be 300 or 400 generous words captured in a declaration that would have the kind of impact of the United States Declaration of Independence, and it wouldn't be miserable and measly. The substantive provision that I champion with the support of constitutional conservatives is actually a body in the Constitution that would enable Indigenous people to have a voice to the Parliament, to provide advice and the views of Indigenous Australians. This is an extremely important idea, and it would have great practical benefit to Indigenous Australians in dealing with the executive government of Australia and the Parliament. So in fact, we're in a situation where constitutional conservatives actually, in being cautious about putting words into the preamble of the Constitution, actually then support Indigenous Australians being represented in a body under the Constitution that would have this role of advising Parliament when it makes laws about us. So my position, Tony, is that symbolism is not enough. There's got to be real practical benefits, real, practical, democratic benefit that must flow from recognition. Ancient Australia needs to have a voice in this Parliament, to this Parliament.
Before we bring in the rest of the panel, we've got another question on this. We'll go straight to Gregory Lehman, who has a question. Go ahead.
Noel, I think I agree with you that symbolism is certainly not enough, but the idea of a declaration of Indigenous recognition might make sense in a country like the US, where documents like the Pledge of Allegiance are part of their culture of patriotism. We don't have that sort of culture here. According to Professor of Constitutional Law Anne Twomey, if substantive rights are sought, they should be included in the text of the Constitution. How can we gamble that the proposal for a declaration will change anything for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when there is so much that is in desperate and urgent need for change?
I think Professor Anne Twomey has produced a draft of a potential provision for an Aboriginal body, a constitutionally recognised Indigenous body that would have the role in the Constitution of providing advice to the Parliament and to the executive government. The Prime Minister, under Professor Twomey's drafting, would have the responsibility of tabling the advice with both houses of this Parliament, so that Indigenous people have an active say in the laws and policies that apply to us who represent only 3% of the Australian democracy. How could that not be of great practical benefit in tackling the kinds of problems that you're alluding to? Of course it will. At the moment, our voice is zero. And our voice has been zero since 1901. This is not just about the declaration outside the Constitution. The substantive provision is the provision that Professor Twomey has now drafted, which would provide for this nationally recognised constitutional body that would have a modest but profound role in providing counsel to our lawmakers.
So no voting power, no senators with powers put in place, but a body that exists outside of Parliament merely to advise.
Dr. Lang, in her essay on Magna Carta, produced by recently as part of our celebrations here, pointed out that the origins of Parliament are in the concept of the duty to provide counsel to the monarch. The duty to provide counsel, which of course evolved into a right to be represented in Parliament and so on. This idea that Indigenous Australians, as an extreme minority, we should have a voice nevertheless. We're excluded from the democratic structures simply because we are such a small minority. And yet we are a special minority in that we were the people here before the coming of Europeans. Just because we are only 3% of the country doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a voice to the Parliament. It would be a voice that would not be easily ignored. At the end of the day, Parliament could say we don't listen to that advice, but of course it would be salutary advice.
I just want to hear from the other panellists on this. I'll come first of all to Bronwyn. I'd like to hear from Luca as well, because it does play into a lot of your ideas of representative democracy changing.
No, I am enormously proud of the fact that the first Aboriginal to be elected to the federal parliament, Neville Bonner, who was a friend of mine, was elected through my party. I'm enormously proud of Ken Wyatt, the member for Hasluck, who strongly speaks out for Aboriginal people. On the Labor Party side, the deputy leader of the opposition in New South Wales, Linda Burney, is Aboriginal. In Western Australia, you've seen people as ministers. I think Ernie Bridges. There are many voices that come. To say there has been no voice, I think, is unfair, because they have been voices that have been have come through the electoral process on merit and are listened to, and their voice has always been appreciated. Now, I'm not saying that's the beginning and end of the dilemma that we have.
How do you respond specifically to the proposal that Noel Pearson has put forward with the support of constitutional conservatives to create such a body to advise the Parliament?
I'm willing to listen to the proposal. I think what would be an absolute tragedy if there was some proposal that was put up and was knocked back. So if it needs more time, if it needs more discussion, then I think we should have it.
Well, this is part of that process. Noel, do you want to attempt to convince Bronwyn Bishop at least?
I think it's important to acknowledge the Indigenous MPs that have been elected. They are a very small slice of this whole scene over the last 100 years. We've only had a small handful. But at the end of the day, they represent the electorates who are not just Indigenous. Ken Wyatt should properly represent, as he does, the majority white electors of his seat of Hasluck. He's there to represent a seat that is not just Indigenous, and he speaks in this Parliament not just on Indigenous issues. He speaks on behalf of his electors.
And his expertise,
this question
health.
As does everybody else, right? This question of Indigenous advice to the Parliament is a specific issue in relation to the fact that Indigenous peoples are a community with a special relationship with this country, suffering a special disadvantage, and whose culture and language and heritage pre-exists the Australian nation. And this Parliament would benefit from their counsel and their advice.
Let's quickly go to another question on this subject from Janet Hunt.
Yes, why would yet another Aboriginal advisory body, in this case to Parliament, lead to better policies for Indigenous people in this country compared to the current hand-picked advisory body to the Prime Minister? Surely it's time to enable Indigenous people to decide for themselves who they want to represent them and to make their own decisions about the policies that affect them, not just advise whitefellas who may tend to ignore them anyway. Feel they know better.
Let's hear from some of our other panellists on this issue first. Luca, do you have any thoughts on this?
I have a general position about democracy. Democracy is simply a way of organising ourselves for no other reason but for ourselves, guess what? So however we want to organise ourselves, let's do it. But let's have an inclusive discussion about it. So I've heard this story here about let Indigenous organise themselves, but well, how are they organising themselves in respect of this Parliament that is supposed to be the place where we are, for the most part, arranging our matters in Australia? So I don't quite understand that. I think from what I hear, Noel's proposal seems quite reasonable to me.
Bret Walker.
Well, it just seems to me at the outset that this is a special issue in that while we all will have to have opinions eventually when there's a proposal, I'm most interested in what Indigenous people think about it. I am nervous about revisiting what happened almost by a verbal sleight of hand in 1967 to give the Commonwealth the power to trump oppressive state legislation. Nervous because I don't want us to go backwards. I confess I hanker still for something really substantive, such as a constitutional prohibition against racial discrimination, except for such beneficial legislation as ought always be within the power of a country where the Indigenous population has been displaced politically by settlers. That's more or less what we have at the moment. We don't have constitutional banning of racial discrimination, but we certainly have Commonwealth power for beneficial legislation.
Would such a change to the Constitution be much harder to get through against the opposition of constitutional conservatives? Because this is where Noel Pearson has ended up. Had the conversation with them, they've said no to racial discrimination clauses within the Constitution, and he sort of realises, I imagine, that against that opposition is going to be much harder.
But the history is, if there's an opposition, other than complete rat bags, referendums won't succeed. I must say I don't like this label, constitutional conservatives, as if other people are, I don't know, bomb throwers. I'd consider myself a constitutional conservative, but our constitution includes section 128 by which it can be amended. So I hope constitutions change slowly. A radical one, changing rapidly, doesn't sound to me like the foundation for anything, for example, that I know Luca's interested in. That is a recipe for disaster.
Let's quickly go to Noel just to respond to that. I mean, the idea of putting a clause into the Constitution to basically ban racial discrimination. Would you have liked to have seen that but found you couldn't get it through?
I was the proponent of it. On the expert panel, the provision in the expert panel was pushed by me. It was the Cape York Institute's submission. An optimal result is the expert panel's position, but there's considerable opposition to its entirety, particularly the racial discrimination provision. Now, stepping to the right, there's a set of propositions about an Indigenous advisory body and a declaration and so on that is equally, it's like a high compromise on the left being matched by a high compromise on the right. And over the next 6 months, I think there ought to be a comprehensive process of conventions involving Indigenous Australians, weighing up the expert panel's position and weighing up this possible compromise with the con so-called. There's a third position, though, which is some kind of miserable middle compromise that actually falls out of the constitutional window of opportunity. And that is a kind of rerun of 1999.
Do you suspect that's where the Parliamentary Committee is going?
Well, it's kind of descending into that trench. You know, there's a real danger that we think, oh, well, let's have a rerun. Remember the provision back in 1999 during the Republican referendum? The provision that got voted down by the Australian people? That was because the proposal was too thin. It was not substantial enough, because symbolic recognition alone was not enough in 1999, and I don't think it's going to be enough in 2016 or 2017.
All right, let's move on to some of the other issues we have to deal with. You're watching a special Magna Carta edition of Q&A live from the Great Hall of Parliament House. The next question comes from Zafar Ahmed.
Bribing is illegal by persons, but nation-states indulge in illegal activities to fulfill their political aims, commitments, and remain unpunished. If proven true, bribing people smugglers by Australian government to turn back boats will be an illegal activity and maybe in breach of international human rights treaty. Does this panel consider achieving political goals by hook or crook as fair? Where do we draw a line and how?
Gillian Triggs.
Well, thank you. That is obviously a very difficult question to consider in the current political environment. From the perspective of international law, everybody who claims our protection in Australia as an asylum seeker is entitled to have that claim considered properly. And it's a tragedy to be denying those who seek our protection an opportunity to do so. But I think it's the view of the Australian government, and certainly our view at the Commission, that obviously we don't want to see drownings at sea. We don't want to see people dying in this terrible trade in which people are being moved across the seas. So there has to be a solution to this problem. Turning boats back and turning them back to our neighbours to look after these asylum seekers is creating other problems with the region. I think in the end, in this parlous situation, we have to look for better diplomatic solutions to the problem. But certainly as a matter of law, we do owe an obligation to these people to assess their claims to refugee status. And that is the great dilemma that we have. But somehow or another, we need to work with our neighbours and to jointly assess their needs and to ensure that they're properly protected.
A quick answer on this one. If it were proven that Australian officials bribed people smugglers, it's not clear, obviously, at this stage, but if it were proven, would that be illegal in the way that bribing Australian wheat board executives was illegal?
Well, I think it would, assuming the facts to be true, and it's very hard to say at the moment, or certainly not appropriate for me to say, but it would presumably be contrary to Australian law. But there are many aspects to this. One is the constant refusal to advise the Australian public as to exactly what is going on, to declare that something is an on-water matter, is wearing very thin, if that's the right metaphor, because in open government, if we're talking about Magna Carta and appropriate systems of government, it's appropriate these days that people are advised as to why we're spending billions of dollars on this program and exactly what's happening as a course of it. The other point that has to be made, I think, is that, of course, we've had many thousands of people being detained because they have paid people smugglers. It's curious, at least, that we would have a government that then pays those same people smugglers.
Bronwyn Bishop, a tough one, obviously, since no one's actually talking about it, whether it did or did not happen, although at least one minister initially denied it completely.
It's very clear. The government went to the polls with a policy that said we will stop the boats. And turning the boats around is part of that policy. And it has been a very successful policy in that no boats have come, and we have prevented over 1,000 people died at sea under the previous administration when 50,000 people arrived illegally in Australia, where over 2,000 children were imprisoned, held into detention. We have now reduced that down to 123, where the policy that says we believe in the nation state and therefore you protect your borders. Now, I know there are people who do not believe in the nation state and think that borders should be open and people should come if they wish.
But
I do not believe in that, and the Australian people showed they didn't either.
Can I just ask you a quick question on this? Because if the rationale of the government is never to aid people smugglers, won't people smugglers hearing that there's a possibility that they could be paid thousands of dollars by government officials to turn their boats back, think it's actually a good idea to set out with people because you could get halfway, someone pays you money, and then you go back again and do it again?
Look, the Prime Minister's made it quite clear that when you don't discuss, and the government does not discuss, on-water operations, where you don't give away what your tactics are so they can work out counter-tactics, it is successful. And
but if you leave them with the impression that you can get paid for going out to sea with people on your boat to take them back again, won't that be a pull factor?
Tony, very simply, it was the former president of Indonesia who told the former Labor government to take the sugar off the table, which was allowing boats to come and allowing people to land in Australia and allowing people to stay. That was the sugar on the table. We had said we would stop the boats and stop those deaths at sea. Not only the ones we knew about, but the ones we didn't know about either.
But is it a problem,
and it's been a
theoretically,
policy.
you take the sugar off the table and put it on the boat? Can I just ask Bret Walker about this?
When the boats are turned around, the policy works. If you don't commit, as the Labor Party still won't commit, to turning around the boats, then you don't have a successful policy.
Bret Walker, if it were proven to be true, would it be illegal?
Well, almost certainly yes. There are two levels of inquiry, though. In relation to crime, call me old-fashioned, but there should be an investigation, proper material gathered and charges considered, and if prosecutors think something should be done about it, we at least live in a country where superior orders will not be a defence. But I don't want to suggest that any Australian Commonwealth officer has done anything wrong. I don't know. And it's not up to the discretion of a Q&A audience or the discretion of anybody else as to whether they've committed an offence. We have a criminal justice system for that. But there's a second stream, which is operating now and which matches curiously with Magna Carta. The first Magna Carta only lasted just over a month, had a council of 25 barons to hold the king to account if, as his character suggested was very likely, he'd renege as soon as he could, which he did. Now that Council of 25 might be seen as a particularly brutal, elitist, undemocratic version of responsible government. There had to be an answering for what you did as monarch. Well, that evolved after many steps, and now we've got a parliament. And our responsible government means that if our executive is doing something in our name, and let me assure you they do, they are acting for the Commonwealth, that's us, the common weal, then in Parliament there ought to be answers to questions. That's the ultimate tribunal, the grand inquest of the nation, where details can be obtained. And from what the Speaker's suggesting, this is going to be a place where there's going to be one of those historical conflicts. Will the executive refuse to answer questions about how public resources have been used? Or, more fundamentally, whether there's been unlawful conduct? Because that's not a matter of the criminal law, that's a matter of responsible government here and now, day by day in Parliament.
Exception to that. The exception to that, Bret, as has been shown by many a Prime Minister, not just the current Prime Minister, when it's a matter of national security, then you don't speak about it publicly.
I don't believe for a moment that it would ever be ruled responsibly that national security is involved in the proposition of potentially unlawful conduct in the defence of our borders.
We'll leave that there because we've got another question. This is from Mohammed Al-Bakiri.
My name is Mohammed Ali Bakiri. I am a Hazara from Afghanistan, fled Taliban to come and seek safety in Australia. I came by boat to Australia at the age of 10, and I spent almost 3 years of my life in a detention centre in Nauru without my parents, as a number, not by my name, but I was called with a number. That experience there was terrible, and something that no child should ever go through. The Australian government kept on telling us that there's no hope that you guys will be settled in Australia. We know the conditions in those detention centres. Horrible, like children have to go through seeing other fellow detainees suffer, the hunger strike that they go through, lack of medical assistance. My question tonight for the panel is that why are the 231 children currently held under immigration detention centre denied rights that for 800 years been a modern democratic legal system here in Australia?
Here today, Noel Pearson, can I start with you?
Tony, I have very young children. Started late. I'm a breeder too. So they're all asleep. But I cannot imagine the experience of children in detention. That is something beyond my ken, that young children in those circumstances. But I'm happy that there's only 100 and something, or I heard 200 there, I heard the Speaker say 100 and something. I'm happy about that situation, that there's not 2,000 or over 1,000. So the government's policy in turning back the boats, I for one never thought it would work. Who in this audience actually thought a policy like that would produce the result it has? I'm kind of sympathetic to that result. I really like the idea of children not being on the high seas, and I like the idea of cutting down the number of children in detention. I think that the government had a very strong rebuttal case to put to the chair of the Human Rights Commission on the basis of that record, and I just regret that the attacks on Gillian have been so vicious. I think they had a strong argument to make. I like a policy that's producing less children on the high seas. We should do more, though. We should have proper facilities at the entry point for asylum seekers that provide health, education, the full set of needs being addressed whilst asylum seekers are being assessed.
I'm just going to quickly go back to our questioner, Mohammed. Now, it's clear from your T-shirt, and in fact we know because you contacted us, that you were down in Canberra to make a protest. I just want to make it clear that you contacted us to come and ask this question, so we know it's not a setup. You came to us to ask this question. We've allowed you to do it. Now I want to hear answers from other people, and I'll start with Gillian Triggs.
Well, I'm delighted to see you in Australia and looking so well and healthy. I have to agree that it's been wonderful to see the children released into the community and on bridging visas, working into schools and leading healthy lives. We still have 127 children in detention in Australia, and the purpose of the Commission's inquiry was to examine the medical and physical conditions of the children of prolonged detention, which has been the case for many of these children. But there's no doubt at all, of course, that release of the children has relieved the problem over the last few months, and we couldn't be happier than to know that they're now out in the community. But we would also like to see the remaining children released into the community. And of course, there are another 95 children on Nauru who presumably, you may even know some of them, but these are the children that we also believe Australia retains responsibility for, and we would like to see those too brought back into Australia and allowed to get on with their lives.
Bronwyn Bishop. Sorry, Luca, you can come to you in a second.
Very quickly, Gillian, if I can say, that report of yours was seen by many, including me, as one that was, if it was to be done, should have been done under the previous government when there were 2,000 children, but you chose to do it afterwards, and that made it very political. And it has made you a very political figure, and therefore you are subject to criticism. As I said before, you have to make the decision. Are you a statutory officer carrying out an obligation with the protection of that office, or do you wish to be a political participant? If you do wish to be a political participant, then you have to be no longer a statutory officer and perhaps stand for office.
Go ahead, Gillian Triggs. You need
Well,
to answer
I
that.
am a statutory officer, and that's a position of independence which allows me to speak based on the evidence and based on the law as truthfully as I can to government and to the Australian people, and that is what I believe I have been doing. I've been meeting my statutory obligations. Indeed, were I to receive frequent praise and commendation from the government, I think the Australian people would have a good reason to ask for my resignation.
It's a very curious argument.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
I wonder if I could just make one further point, and that is that throughout the years of the former government, we produced 180 different pieces of work, reports, mandatory detention centres, reports to the government. We had a special inquiry into the use of wrist x-rays to determine the age of children, and I went to Christmas Island and to various other detention centres. So I think it would be fair to say that we worked as strongly during the former government to protest against the holding of children for long periods of time as we did under the new government. Although our plan, of course, was to hold an inquiry in 2014, we weren't to know which government was going to win that election. And also that inquiry was, of course, backward-looking. It wasn't for the forward months. It was to examine what was the effect on the children of the period in which they were held in such large numbers and for such long periods of time. So perhaps I can finish, if I may, by saying that my position is not a political one. We work according to the law at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and we try to ensure that our evidence is accurate and well-founded. But unfortunately, of course, Many of our findings and recommendations are interpreted in political ways, and I'm afraid in the human rights context, it's very hard not to be perceived to be political, and that's really something we have to manage. But I can certainly assure the Australian people that the Human Rights Commission operates in a very neutral way, and we operate on the basis of the rule of law, which brings us, of course, back to the Magna Carta.
Luca, Belgiorno-Nettis want to get involved? Sorry, and you can come back in. Go ahead, Luca.
Thank you. Yeah. I think what this particular issue about refugees has highlighted in this community is that we've lost a certain amount of trust in our public decision-making, even though, of course, it's a very fraught issue and it's not said that there might still be differences in terms of policy. I cannot help but think that we could not achieve a more inclusive and a more reasonable approach to this particular fraught problem. And I think we could have achieved that by having a group of everyday Australians, not adversarial contested election processes, but everyday Australians in a sort of citizen jury selected at random to reflect the community at large, discussing not just this issue, but all issues, because that's where I see our parliament potentially moving, to have an inclusive group of everyday people that can bring their lived experience to the table.
Bronwyn Bishop, just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, I suppose that's what the government considers focus groups to be.
No. Look, Luca and I have known each other
40 years?
40 years?
50 years.
Mainly through the arts, where we agree on many things. But we have had this discussion from time to time, and basically we have an adversarial system because we believe in different things. For me, I belong to the political party I joined because I believe in the principles of free enterprise and the philosophy of individualism. If I was someone who believed in collectivism, I would have joined the other side of politics. Now that framework, let me finish, Luca. That framework means that you form policies in accordance with those principles. Free enterprise tells me that the business of government is to do those things that the private sector cannot or will not do, and to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. And within those confines, we develop policies which are different from the Labor Party, and therefore we will have
We're fast running out of time, so we
it.
better hear what Luca has to say about that.
I think the community at large doesn't necessarily relate to those fossilised relics of ideological positions. Sorry,
Well,
and that's not, with all due respect, that's not referring to anyone at this table. I think, Bronwyn, please, my opportunity. Thank you.
Maybe.
I think we could do a whole lot better with the way we have our political dialogue. The way we should be able to build trust in our public decision making is to have people like you and in the audience across Australia represented at the table, at the top table. The citizen juries that we do at New Democracy prove that everyday people selected at random, when they come together, they make sensible decisions. I don't understand why we can't look to have something like that as a citizen senate, where people can come, 150 randomly selected citizens, as a trialled upper house, where people come rotated every 2 or 3 years. It's a paid service, national services. I bet you most people, if they were given that opportunity in this great hall and across Australia, would jump at that opportunity to see how we could make Australia great.
It's an ambitious plan. We'll come back to that again on another time. We have time for just one last question. This one comes from Karan Damija.
This is to Professor Triggs. You've talked a lot about the erosion of principles and rights since 9/11, especially some of those mentioned in the Magna Carta. Considering a lot of those changes have been bipartisan, how can we reverse them? And secondly, being a devil's advocate, if they are supported by the public, why do 800-year-old principles matter? Shouldn't public sentiment be the first consideration?
Well, public sentiment's obviously very important as it's reflected in the democratic process. But I think the principles that emerged from the Magna Carta, particularly the notion that the executive is subject to the law, is a principle that underpins our democratic system, and I believe that the Australian public supports that core principle. I also think, of course, that the Australian public understands that the executive cannot detain people without charge or trial. Just as Australia can decide that people who fought against Australia should lose their citizenship, that's an exercise of sovereignty, but it's an exercise that must be subject to an evidence-based determination of our courts. And that is our system. It's underpinned a very successful democratic, multicultural society in Australia, and I think that we need to understand those principles and to protect and preserve them for the future.
All right, we're going to quickly whip around to get the Bret Walker on the, really, I suppose, the dilemma between public opinion and the rule of law.
Well, I'm sure, given my ancestry, I wouldn't have been a baron in 1215, but I don't feel very happy 800 years later swapping the tyranny of one bad king for the tyranny of a majority. And the whole point of the rule of law is that a tiny minority will be able to stand against a popular will or a populist will. And majoritarian tyranny is something that seems to me to be the target of civilised, sophisticated, Australian parliamentary democracy, responsible government. And when we talk about the sentiment of the public, I think we've got to remember that it was the sentiment of the public that informed most lynch mobs. And I don't want anything to do with that version of rule.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Can I just make a point? I'm not sure whether people understand there's a big difference between popular opinion and what I'm talking about in terms of...
Oh, no, I think so. No, we're on to a different question
and may
altogether.
I say,
Right,
nothing in my last comments is about the citizens' conclaves, juries that Luca has explained.
No, I think that's a misunderstanding. Let's go quickly to Noel Pearson. The tyranny of the majority. Do you fear it?
That is our predicament. 3% of the country, the original peoples of this continent, and we don't have a great leverage with the institution of Parliament. So from our perspective, that majority can seem tyrannous. And the proposal that we have for Indigenous recognition has to answer that predicament. It has to answer that problem. Majoritarianism has been at the heart of our problem these past 2 centuries. And I think we're at a stage, it is a great country, it is a great nation, it is a great commonwealth. The Magna Carta is a brilliant source of our heritage, that British heritage. I say it's something that new Australians, ancient Australians, British Australians all share in the benefits of. But there's also an Indigenous heritage in this country. It's 53,000 years old plus. And that's a heritage that's not just ours as Indigenous peoples. I hope that in the future it will be the heritage of the rest of Australia as well. But if we don't, through constitutional recognition, in a substantive and modest way, answer this problem of majoritarian tyranny. Tyranny is a strong word, but the fact that the mouse, the 3% mouse versus the 97% elephant, is a situation that we've got to confront and deal with and answer.
Bronwyn Bishop, you're obviously in a majority in Parliament, but do you fear the tyranny of the majority in a more general sense?
Look, I love this country. I trust the Australian people. I don't like it when people say they won't understand or it's too complicated for them. That's disparaging. They know very well. They're smart, they understand, and they care for their country as well. And what I want to see is a continuation of the democracy that we have first inherited and then made very much our own. Osminster, I call it. Westminster it started, Washminster it may have had a touch with, but Osminster it is now. If you heed the words of Winston Churchill, that democracy is the most chaotic, and I'm paraphrasing, chaotic, messy system of government you could possibly have.
It's the worst system of government apart from all those that have been tried before.
You're quoting it better than I am.
Words, And I say, let's try something new.
Well, I'll say to you, I think it's the best thing we've got going at this stage. And quite frankly, Luca, I don't want to be told by a selected group what I must think.
And I think that is, I'm sorry, we could allow this to go on for a long time. I'm so sorry, we're 6 minutes over time, I've just been told. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Bret Walker, Bronwyn Bishop, Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, Gillian Triggs, Noel Pearson. Thank you, and special thanks to the presiding officers, one of whom, of course, is sitting on the table here with us, Bronwyn Bishop, and all the wonderful staff of Parliament House and our audience for those great questions. Now give yourselves a round of applause too. Okay, next Monday we'll be joined by American anti-poverty campaigner Linda Tirado, the Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Steve Chobo, Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Joel Fitzgibbon, Advertising Director, Dee Madigan, Government Relations Consultant, Graham Morris, and the angel voice singer of Anthony and the Johnsons, Anthony Hegarty. So look out for an extra special Q&A on Thursday too, when Tom Ballard leads the discussion on our changing attitudes to sexuality and gender, after presenting Between a Frock and a Hard Place, a documentary celebrating Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. It's a 2-hour Q&A special starting at 8:30 this Thursday night. Till next Monday's Q&A, good night.